Have you ever felt like you're wasting your life?
Damn.
Okay. Funny one stuff. But seriously, like sometimes when we feel that way, like we're wasting our lives or we've wasted time in our lives or we've wasted seasons of our lives, it's a really bitter thing to feel. To go through moments in your life where you go, I think I wasted an important period of time. It's interesting that we use the word waste to describe our lives sometimes. The idea of waste doesn't just sort of mean, oh, I went through a hard season in my life, or oh, I feel bad about something. Waste means we produced something that was just meaningless excess. Waste means there was maybe something valuable, but it like slipped through our fingers. What a waste. It's a really bitter thing to experience in life, to feel like I worked at something over time, I invested in a relationship over time, I invested in a degree program that didn't actually result in a meaningful experience in my working career. I did all these things, and I produced something, but it seems actually at the end of the day to just have been meaningless excess, waste. It's a painful thing to experience. It's also interesting when we think about waste. Our own actions are in the forefront. Again, when we think about having wasted some aspect of our life, that's different from saying someone else did something to me and it hurts, or I rolled the dice and it didn't go my way. When we feel like we wasted something in our lives, it's really our own actions that are front and center. We're sort of saying, I did something over time, or tried to do something and pursue something over time, and it didn't produce what I wanted it to. So really at issue, when we feel like we've wasted something in our lives, is our own inability to reliably do things that produce meaningful results in our life. And we experience that all the time. We have some things in our lives that we do them, and they seem to produce meaningful things. And then we have this whole other category of stuff that we just do things over time, and we go, why am I not able to reliably stack enough things on top of each other in the right order for a long enough period of time in order to get that meaningful thing produced in my life? It just seems, this category of my life, the things I'm doing, it just seems to keep producing meaningless excess in my life. Over and over and over again. And it puts it in this whole conversation is, why is it so hard then to simply do the things that we want to do to produce the things that we want to see in our lives? Isn't that really what's at issue in the question of waste in our lives? Wasted season, wasted time, wasted feelings, wasted relationships, wasted experiences. Why is it so hard to actually do the things we want to do in our lives? This is the question that we'll be asking today. We're walking through a sermon series in the text of Galatians. It's been a wonderful time. We've just been walking verse by verse through the text. It's been amazing. We've opened up the Bible and God's been speaking to us. God's so good. God's a great communicator. He really does a wonderful job. The issue is that we're not incredible at receiving the communication. But we're trying to grow in that in this church. We're working on it. As a result of that, I would encourage you to pull out your Bibles. Wow, church Bibles. You can pull them out. If you don't have a Bible with you, you don't need to feel bad about that. You've got Bibles stacked up on the welcome table. You can grab them. Be courageous. Go out, grab a Bible. You can keep it if you don't have a Bible. You know, so many of the spiritual ills that we're going through in the world today and in the church today can be boiled all the way down to the fact that your average follower of Jesus doesn't feel like they can just open up the Bible and hear God speak to them. We feel alien to the Bible. We can't just open it up and go, I know God's going to speak to me. And so one of the things that we've been doing in this church for the last couple months is I've been not putting the scripture passage up on the slides, the main scripture passage. All the supplemental stuff will be up there, but the main stuff is not going to be up there because if you don't feel comfortable flipping open a Bible right here, right now, you are never going to feel comfortable flipping open a Bible. So we're doing that. So flip open your Bibles, Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 to 18. If you 1 and 2 that give you all kinds of context. You look at Galatians, who's writing, who it's to, all that sort of stuff that you could possibly want to know. All you need to know for today is that the book of Galatians is really a letter. It's an ancient letter written to Christians in the first century that were living in the Roman province of Galatia, which is modern-day Turkey. I'm loving the head nodding. Hannah can teach this to you right now. She can rattle it all off. The Roman province of Galatia, which is modern-day Turkey. And he's writing to Christians who have come under the influence of a teaching that is telling them they've got to get a whole bunch of things right in their life over time in order to live a meaningful life with God and people. And the Apostle Paul thinks that that teaching is antithetical to the gospel of God's grace in Jesus, and so he's writing them a letter to try to get them out from under the burden and the force of this teaching. Again, our text today is Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 to 18. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. We are not able to do what we want to do. We are unable, over time, in a reliable way, to do the things that we want to do. We are bombarded by the desires of the flesh. I was reading out the ESV here, and it uses the word desires in verse 16 and 17 to talk about the desires of the flesh. But desires is, I don't think, a super helpful word here. Maybe lusts could be better, although lust makes us think about, like, well, lust and the sexual lust, that's also not really what we're talking about here. What we're really talking about here is like an appetite or a craving. Something that is like deep inside us, that as soon as it's woken up, it's immediately present. And it's like everything that we can do to not respond to it. Paul says here that we are bombarded by the appetites, the cravings of the flesh. The Greek word here is the Greek word epithumia, and it's best translated as something like an appetite or craving, deep innate desire. Ancient Greek philosophers understood how mastering the appetites of the flesh and the appetites of the body was one of the first steps to trying to live sort of a higher philosophical way of being. So it's a very common thread in ancient Greek philosophy for philosophers to tell you, you need to master the appetites of the flesh and the appetites of the body, the things that are immediately pressing upon you, so that you can pursue anything else that's meaningful in life. Because if you don't master them, you'll just be dominated by whatever's pressing upon you in the moment at any given point in time. For example, Plato puts these words into the mouth of Socrates in his Phaedo dialogue. This is what the text says. No one may join the company of the gods who has not practiced philosophy and is not completely pure when he departs from life. No one but the lover of learning. It is for this reason that those who practice philosophy in the right way keep away from all bodily passions, master them, and do not surrender to them. And that phrase there, bodily passage, is almost the exact same phrase that Paul is using in the text today. The word passions there is the Greek word epithumia. Plato uses the word soma for body, whereas Paul is talking about not just the body, but the whole fleshly nature, so he uses the word sarx. So it's a very similar idea. These ancient philosophers were understanding the power of our physical impulses and the things that just bombard us during the day to be the major thing that demand all our attention. And if we don't get control over them, we're not able to pursue the things that are actually meaningful because we're just bombarded by our appetites and cravings that we experience at any given point in time. Our physical impulses are super powerful. They're super, super strong. We know this, obviously, through categories like addiction. Right? Addiction is a strong way in which our physical impulses can be linked in tightly bound biological, neurological, and chemical ways to substances that put us in a place where we're so bound up by some physical impulse that we're having that we do not have control over it. It masters us, and we're not able to get past that addiction and pursue something that's meaningful or valuable in life. Of course, many people struggle from addiction. Some statistics would say that as many as 1 in 10 people struggle at some point in their life with some sort of substance use disorder. There are softer addictions that almost all of us struggle with in our own ways. Patterns of behavior that we're addicted to. Ways in which relationships and context and our own way of being in the world get wound into a tightly wound pattern and we become stuck doing some sort of pattern of behavior over and over and over again. One way in which this happens is, of course, with addiction to technology in the modern world. Of course, technology is not a substitute. You don't consume it in the same way that you might consume something else that is addictive. But the power of our own habits, alongside social power and social pressure and our neurology, makes technology addiction, even though it's not a substance, something that can truly dominate our physical existence. A 2019 study published by Statista said that 55% of 23 to 83-year-olds self-describe themselves as being somewhat or completely addicted to technology. And a 2019 study commissioned by the tech care company Asurion found that in a study of about 2,000 U.S. adult smartphone users, the average U.S. adult checks their phone. I'm interested. What's your guess? What you get? I know it's going to hurt. The number's going to hurt. What do you think it is?
Per day or hour?
Per day.
200
times.
Oh, yeah. You are such a pessimistic view of the relationship. 10,000! 1,000 times!
800 times.
800? Oh my gosh, wow, you're way overshooting this.
200 times.
20.
That would be 96. 96 times a year.
That's all.
Which for some of you, I guess, you're like, oh my gosh, really 96. For me, when I reflect on that, I'm like, I feel like I remember 3 or 4 times a day that I checked my phone, but I'm sure if I started to actually mark how many times I picked up my phone and looked at it, it would start to go up and up and up and up. In our own lives, these things can happen, where we become overwhelmed by some constellation of physical impulses, and it keeps us from doing the things that we actually want to do. How many times these days do you get to the end of the day and say, God, I wish I'd spent 2 less hours on my phone. I really wanted to get here at the end of the day. I want to do this at the end of the day. But I'm dominated by this thing that I'm not totally in control over. But then that day becomes a week. And then that week becomes a month. And then that month becomes a couple of years. Because then a habit is formed. And we're not in control of the way that these things work itself out. And then we look back and go, I've spent so much time doing this thing over here, and I haven't actually pursued the things that I wanted to pursue. Of course, we then feel doubly condemned by this. We feel bad about it. We look back on a day or a week and say, I didn't do actually what I wanted to do in that week, and we beat ourselves up. Paul uses this self-condemnation language. He uses the word law to describe it. He talks about at the end in verse 18, if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. The law here being the idea that we beat ourselves up by the things that we're dominated by the flesh. So we sort of are in this like double prison, where on the one hand we're dominated by stuff inside ourselves that we don't have great control over, but then once we recognize it, we like are dominated by the fact that we feel bad about it. When we beat ourselves up about it over and over. Like, I couldn't feel worse about it. And then that feeling bad about it also keeps us from getting out and doing the things that we want to do. In sum, we become bound to this sort of prison of this impulsive presence that we're in, and how badly we feel about the fact that we're bound up by it. And these things bind us to the constrictions of everything that's limited and physical about us. We can live in this place where we're just dominated by the now, what we're experiencing right now, what I want to satisfy right now. And the problem with all these things is that these really are just appetites and cravings that we experience. They're not things that we actually desire. The things that we actually desire and want in life, those things are often not things that we can satisfy by responding to an impulse right now. Those are things that are often out there. We don't have them yet. They're oftentimes even immaterial. They're like the feeling of joy and satisfaction that comes from a fulfilling relationship. The feeling of joy and satisfaction that comes from sowing things in our work and reaping a harvest. And we get that by sowing at a job over and over and over again over time, and then a harvest comes back to us. But we're in this place where we're at sort of this internal war between the things that we immediately experience and our appetites, the things that are immediate presence, it's telling us we want right now, but the things that if we were to sort of sit down and be sane and sober for a second, we would say, what I actually want is this thing over here. This thing that I don't have yet. It's external to myself, but it's a good thing. But the fact that I'm not able to just lay hold of it right now, like I can with these cravings, these appetites that I have, make them very, very difficult to pursue. The things that we actually desire, not crave, the things we desire, that we want, that we wish for, these things are outside of ourselves. They're hopes, they're dreams, they're promises, they're things that are external to who we are right now. And while our cravings and appetites and impulses are inside of ourselves, what we actually desire is outside of ourselves. We want to do what are outside of ourselves. That's what we actually wish that we would be doing and how we would be spending our time. Paul says that the opposite of the flesh is the spirit. He says in verse 17, the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh. For these things are opposed to one another. So he's creating a dichotomy here between things of the flesh and things of the spirit. If we were to understand spirit then, in opposition to the flesh, we're understanding flesh as things that are material, inside ourselves, and full of our appetites and cravings, whereas spirit then is immaterial, outside of ourselves, and are full of the things that we actually desire and want and wish for. Now, the spirit may be immaterial, but that does not mean that it's not real. In some ways, this is like the definition of all things spirit. Things that are immaterial, but very, very real. Things that are immaterial, but that are real and pressing on our lives. The Bible teaches that there's something about this immateriality that actually is the basis of everything material that's created. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. A very real immateriality was present before God gave shape to anything physical and material. And in fact, it was immateriality, real immateriality, that gave shape and meaning to everything physical that God then created. This still happens today in our own lives. And it can be hard for us to point it out when we see it, but we often can feel it very strongly when we don't see it. Right? Immateriality and the promise and reality of these things that we don't see, that we can't put our physical hands on, they give shape and meaning to the things that are material in our lives. Right? It's why we can have so much stuff and still be so unhappy. Right? It's why we can get material things that we wanted and still feel empty. Because it's possible to have materiality without the reality of God's immateriality. And when we have that, we notice something's missing. We feel empty. We feel like there's no joy. We feel like there's no happiness. Yet, when we have certain material things that have come by way of a shaping of the immaterial, it can be full of joy. It can be full of meaning. It can be full of purpose. Now listen, some of you, as I'm talking about immateriality, might be saying, I don't know about that. People back there, in some other time, in some other culture, believed in immateriality and spirits, but we know things better now, and we have physical material explanations for everything that happened in the world, and there's a strong argument to be made for that everything in the world can be explained through physical material processes and causes. I can't speak to everything about that in this moment, but I do just sort of want to suggest to you just an argument for immateriality and the reality of immateriality based on your own experience. When you experience a bodily craving, you automatically assume that there's something that can meet that craving. In fact, from your earliest moment, when you come out of the womb and bam, you're crying. Your body is like, there's something that I need and I need it right now. You know in your body, in your flesh, you automatically assume that there's something that exists in the physical world that has a correspondence to that appetite and craving that you're experiencing. Right, like thirst. You're thirsty, you're like, oh, there must be something to quench this thirst. It's called water. We drink all sorts of other things to quench our thirst, but it's called water and it quenches your thirst. Could it be that that's also true about the immaterial things in our lives? That when we feel like a longing, and we need to reach for language like soul and spirit to describe that longing, maybe that also is a sign to us that there's something real in the immaterial world that corresponds to that spiritual thirst that we have. If we assume our bodies work that way, why don't we assume that our souls work that way? That when our souls are thirsting for something, we don't listen to them? I'm just in a bad mood today. Why don't we listen to our souls in the same way that we listen to our flesh? That there's something that the immaterial part of us longs for and thirsts for and craves for, and that thirst is a sign that it's real. That thirst is a sign that that longing has a name. Paul here uses a totally different word. He doesn't use the word epithumia. he uses a totally different word to describe longings and desires that are not just cravings of the flesh. This is the word that shows up in verse 18. In verse 17, when the text says, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. That word there, want, is referring to good longings that we have that are not physical appetites and cravings. It's the Greek word here, thelo, and it's referring not to physical appetites and cravings, but to things that we wish for, things that we desire, things that we want. And Paul says that the flesh and the spirit then are at war. We have things that we thelo, that we desire, that we long for, that are outside of ourselves, but internally, in the present, right now, we're dominated by all our epithumia, our cravings, our appetites, the things that in any given moment, they come to us and say, satisfy me right now. No, of course, it's not that physical desires or pleasures are bad. I'm not creating some flesh-spirit dualism here. It's just that our pleasurable physical impulses, the appetites and cravings that we have, that we want to be satisfied, those are supposed to be signs to us that we have gone down a good path in life. They're not supposed to be the things that dominate our sense of the path we go down. Does that make sense? It's about ordering them in the right way. That when we pursue a desire that's out here, something that we thelo, along the way we often experience that certain appetites that we have are met. It's when it becomes out of order that they become dominant, and we no longer can say no to them, and we get put off the path of pursuing the things that we actually want. It's about ordering them in the right way, because if they're not ordered in the right way, our internal cravings and appetites, just the things that we experience on a minute-by-minute basis, that wreck the way we want to spend our days, or spend our weeks, or spend our months, or spend our seasons, or spend our years, they're too strong, and they live too close to us. They're in here already. The things that our better parts desire, they're out here. We're reaching for them. We're longing for them. But the appetites, they're in here. And they're so strong and so pressing. And so we find ourselves always in this place where the things that we want that are out there are warring against just the things that we experience that we crave in here. And we find ourselves trapped, often doing things that we wish we weren't doing. Paul describes this in Romans chapter 7, verses 15 and 17 and 19. He says this. He says, I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Don't we experience this in our lives over and over and over? And maybe it doesn't always show up here in such stark language as evil and sin. Although, I don't know, if we do little things over time that seem kind of innocuous, but they keep us from walking the good path that God has given us, aren't those things kind of evil? Even though they look innocuous at the time. Paul says, I have things out here that I desire and I want to do, but there are things in here that dominate my experience of myself, and I am not strong enough to stop doing that so that I can pursue the things I actually want to pursue. And we just look back on our lives and say, yeah, that's the story of that season of my life. I should have worked harder back there. Or maybe I would be somewhere different if I had spent this time differently. Or I knew that that relationship probably wasn't the best for me, but I just wanted it right now. And so I said yes to that. And now a couple years later, I'm realizing that it wasn't something that was good for me. We have all sorts of areas and avenues in our lives that are marked by this exact struggle of looking at ourselves and saying, I know better. I know there's something better. I know I want different. I know there's something different to pursue. But we are just not strong enough to wrestle out the impulses that we have in ourselves. And so we're just in this place of constant internal battle. We just are constantly at war with ourselves over these things. And that really is painful. And it's full of condemnation. We're not able to wrestle the dark parts of ourselves down as much as we want to. And this is what the world has to offer us. Of course, there are people who will try to speak into this aspect of your life, this internal war that's raging. And what they'll say is just, here are more tips and tricks for getting better at mastering your cravings. And it's like they're just repeating the advice of ancient Greek philosophers from 2,500 years ago. It's the same advice. Do better. Get better at taming your impulses. And that's super great for Plato to write about in 500 BC in ancient Greece, but he didn't have to, he had goats bleeding in his ears or whatever, He didn't have a device living in his pocket that was built to, play out every single physical impulse that he had. We might be okay, honestly, with just living in this place of saying we're just never going to get past this internal war if our soul didn't testify to us on its own that we long for a day when we're not at war with ourselves anymore. We somehow know deep down that we weren't made to be at war with ourselves. That I wasn't made to constantly be wrestling out the things that I feel like I crave right now and the better things that I'm longing for over here. The way in which our longings in our bodies, even our experience in the present, our hopes in the future, that those things are just in a battle royale against one another, that we know that we were not made to actually experience life that way. And it's just so funny. Maybe we can get used to the battle thing. But the soul that's in you, that God put there, the witness to your being that you were made for a completely different way of life than you're experiencing now, that voice won't let you settle for the constant, chronic internal battle. That voice won't let you forget that it's not supposed to be that way. That voice won't let you ever lay all the way down and say, I guess this is all that's left for me. That voice says to you, you were made to be at peace inside yourself. You are made for your body and your spirit to be at peace. You are made for your present and your hopes for the future to be at peace. You are made to be at peace. Not a peace that comes from mastering and wrestling out the appetites in here, but a peace that comes from the desires that are out here getting in here. What if that could happen? What if the things that we long for that are out there, that we just can't reach for strong enough, we don't have long enough arm, what if those things could just get in here? Instead of needing to wrestle out the cravings in here so that we can reach for things out there, what if there was a way for the things out there to get in here so that they live as closely to us as our cravings and desires actually do? What if that could happen? That's exactly the manner of living that God wants His children to live. That's exactly the way of life that God is trying to invite us into. God wants to put the power of all of those things that are external and immaterial. He wants to take the power of those things and let them dwell inside of you, so that you're no longer fighting a battle with what's going on in here and what you want out there, but so that what you want out there now lives in here, such that your present is in line with the things that you're pursuing, because the things that you're pursuing somehow already live in your present. This is what Paul is exhorting the Galatians to do when he says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit." This is an interesting picture, walking by the Spirit, because it marries a spiritual category, spirit, with a physical category, walking. Paul says, walk like in your body by the Spirit. The Greek word here for walk is the word peripateo, and there was an ancient school of Greek philosophy called the Peripatetics. Aristotle was the founder of the Peripatetic school. And they were called Peripatetics because legend has it they would do their philosophical discussions as they walked to the temple of Apollo on this walkway that became known as the Peripatetos, just the walkway, the place where they walked. And Aristotle would walk and teach as they went with one another. And so there was already sort of this this idea in the ancient world that a way of life might be true once we got ideas out of the head and got them into the body, such that we would begin to live in line with the way that we're thinking, or the things that we want or are pursuing. But Paul says, I'll take that wisdom and take you a step further. We'll up the ante just slightly more. What if it wasn't just about living a way of life where you're so inundated by your ideas and the things that you desire that your body falls in line? What if we were able to take the power of the things that you want and desire, the power of those things that you don't have yet but that your soul longs for, and grab that power, not just raw ideas, but power, and take that and put that in your body, such that you walked by power that was able to take you into the things that you want to move into your life. That, Paul says, is walking by the Spirit, where the power of the things of God that are not flesh but are immaterial begins to live in your flesh and begins to empower you to not just do the things that you want to do, but crave the things that you want to do. To have the appetite for the things that you want to do. Paul says that is a body that's animated by God's good immaterial, God's good Spirit. Paul says if you walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the cravings of the flesh. He doesn't say walk by the Spirit and don't gratify the cravings of the flesh. He says when you start walking by the Spirit, your appetites are going to be so bound up with the good things that God has for you that you will no longer want to satisfy in a moment-by-moment way those cravings by the flesh that you're bombarded by. You know, Jesus did this. All of this stuff that we're talking about, this was something that Jesus did. We don't just now hear these things and say, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to start walking by the Spirit. We actually have to look at a source from which we can receive this way of life. And this is something actually that Jesus did. Because when Jesus was headed to the cross, when he knew that his journey was going to end in the cross, he actually had a moment, right, in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the appetites and cravings of his body were screaming to him, saying, do not take another step down this path. Do not take another step down this path. We do not want that. And they're screaming at him with all the force of every appetite and craving that we ever feel in our lives. When the immediate desires of our present say, that's good and that's not good, and go forward in that knowledge. And Jesus sat there in that garden and he said to his Father, and he spoke out of the appetites and cravings of his flesh and said, I would really love it if there was another way. I would really like to not walk down this way of brutal, intense physical pain. Could you take this cup from me? And yet, something happened in that time of prayer where he knew that he was supposed to walk that path, and so he did. He endured 36 hours of some of the most brutal physical experience that anyone's ever endured. The book of Hebrews tells us what happened in that moment. Why Jesus was able to not be dominated by the appetites and cravings of the flesh. Why he went and endured the cross anyways. This is what Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For the joy. 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 The immateriality of joy becoming present somehow in his body, such that it was stronger than all of the other physical appetites and cravings that his body was trying to speak to him. Joy, the promise of future joy, and the present reality of his joy right now was so strong, was so present, was such a better appetite for him, that he said, for the joy that I'm experiencing now and that I know is coming in the future, I crave that more than what my body is telling me right now. For joy. That's what it looks like. And then he got up and walked by the Spirit to the cross. The Spirit giving him joy. That's why Jesus endured the cross. And we receive by faith that same ability to walk by the Spirit in our own lives, as God says, I know that you are bombarded in some area of your life by some appetites or cravings that you cannot control, but I will give you a better craving. I will give you a better taste, a better appetite for something else. For joy, for love, for hope, for goodness, for satisfaction. And I will give you by faith a stronger taste for those things that will carry you past the bombardment of whatever physical appetite you're experiencing right now. All that we have to do in response to those things is just to actually then be led by the Spirit. Which, just to bring it all the way down, we'll just start with joy. What would it be to be led by joy? To be led now by where you experience joy. To see joy as a sign of the leading of the Spirit in your life. Where is joy calling me? Where is laughter calling me? To allow the Spirit to create a taste in you for those things. Some of you, you've even forgotten the taste for joy. That I might make decisions in my life out of joy. What does that even taste like anymore? God can revive that in you, but when you see it and when your soul responds to it, you have to follow it. You have to be led by it. And when that comes up against something else in your life, we're well, I have to do this thing now. Do you? What does joy say? What does the Spirit lead you into? Be led, Paul says, by the Spirit. Allow the Spirit to be out in front of you and then putting you in the presence of things that will give you a taste for what the Spirit has. But then you also have to walk. You have to go. Paul says, be led by the Spirit. That's a motion thing. So there's probably going to be some risky thing the Spirit's calling you into. Something where the Spirit says, you're here right now, but I want to move you over here. And we have to be willing to follow the Spirit in that. To walk, to move, to have motion in those things. In all of this, as we receive in our flesh the Spirit, bringing to us the things that we actually want and giving us a taste for that. How can we do any of that if we haven't first received the source of all these longings? How can we receive any of that if we haven't first received God? We have to first receive God. Jesus received God. Jesus first received God, the joy that God has set before him. And so he was able to endure the cross. We have to receive God. Otherwise, it's just wishful thinking. Otherwise, it's just, I'm going to power of positive thinking my way into a happier future. We first have to receive the source from which all those longings actually come from. And when we receive him, we receive his Spirit, and he gives us a taste, a craving for the things that we actually want our life to be about.